the model that exposed an industry blind spot. It wasn't meant to reveal anything. It was supposed to blend in, compete quietly, and take its place among familiar rivals. Instead, it uncovered a flaw so obvious in hindsight that no one could believe it had been overlooked for so long. Because this model didn't fail where others failed. It failed where no one was looking. To understand why this car became such an uncomfortable reference point, we need to examine how the industry defined success at the time. Performance figures were climbing. Technology lists were expanding. Design cycles accelerated. Everything measurable suggested progress. But one dimension remained largely invisible. Use, not performance on paper, not features at launch. Actual daily use over years of ownership. How cars fit into lives rather than markets. This model was engineered around that question, almost accidentally. The team behind it wasn't chasing disruption. They were tasked with solving practical problems. Reduce friction, simplify maintenance, stabilize long-term behavior. Decisions were guided by service data, not trend forecasts. Engineers spent more time studying breakdown reports than concept sketches. The result was a vehicle that felt ordinary at first glance. No dramatic styling, no headline-grabbing numbers, no experimental technology. Reviewers described it as competent, sensible, even boring. It earned polite praise and little excitement. Then time passed. While competitors aged unpredictably, this model didn't. Ownership costs stayed flat. Repairs were straightforward. Systems behaved consistently year after year. Nothing about the car demanded attention, and that turned out to be its most radical trait. Owners noticed something strange. They stopped thinking about the car, not because it was invisible, but because it never interrupted their lives. It didn't surprise them with issues. It didn't require constant updates or explanations. It simply worked quietly and predictably through seasons, mileage, and neglect. That silence exposed a blind spot. The industry had been measuring what cars could do, not how they lived. And once that distinction became clear, this unremarkable model began to look less like a compromise and more like an indictment. Because if a car designed around unglamorous realities could outperform celebrated competitors over time, then the metrics everyone trusted were incomplete. The model hadn't revealed a flaw in engineering. It had revealed a flaw in attention. And now that flaw could no longer be ignored. As ownership data accumulated, the contrast became impossible to dismiss. Competitors rotated through updates, recalls, and revisions. This model stayed largely unchanged, and that stability became its quiet advantage. Service centers noticed first. Technicians saw the car less often. When it arrived, the issues were predictable, followed expected patterns. Parts were accessible. Diagnostics were straightforward. Nothing about the vehicle fought the people responsible for keeping it alive. That was unusual. Modern cars had grown increasingly adversarial. Layers of software obscured simple problems. Repairs demanded specialized tools and training. Small issues triggered cascading complications. Complexity wasn't just technical, it was experiential. This model avoided that trap. Its systems were designed to degrade gracefully. Components failed independently instead of dragging others with them. Software updates were conservative, focused on stability rather than novelty. Engineers resisted the temptation to add features that complicated long-term ownership. At first, this restraint looked like stagnation. Sales teams worried the car lacked excitement. Marketing struggled to differentiate it in a crowded field. Reviewers continued to describe it as sensible, but unremarkable. The blind spot persisted, until owners began replacing their cars. Competitors cycled out after a few years, their novelty spent and their upkeep rising. This model stayed. Families kept it longer. Fleets extended replacement intervals. High-mileage examples flooded the used market and performed just as reliably as newer ones. Residual values reflected the shift. While other models depreciated rapidly, this one stabilized, then climbed, not because it became fashionable, but because it became trusted. Buyers knew what they were getting and valued the absence of surprise. The industry reacted slowly. Some dismissed the data as demographic bias. Others argued the model appealed only to conservative buyers. But as the pattern repeated across regions and use cases, those explanations lost weight. The blind spot was systemic. The industry optimized for acquisition. This model optimized for retention. And retention turned out to be a powerful metric no one had prioritized. Because keeping a customer satisfied over time proved harder and more valuable than impressing them once. Engineers studying the car realized the implication was uncomfortable. They hadn't been building bad vehicles. They had been building short-lived relationships. And this model had exposed that truth simply by refusing to interrupt people's lives. The question now facing the industry was no longer whether the blind spot existed. It was whether anyone was willing to redesign around it. The realization triggered quiet discomfort inside boardrooms and design studios alike. If long-term ease of ownership mattered more than novelty, then entire development strategies needed rethinking. Product cycles built around frequent replacement suddenly looked fragile. Engineers revisited assumptions they had taken for granted. Why were systems layered instead of simplified? Why did new features arrive faster than owners could understand them? Why was aging treated as an afterthought rather than a design constraint? The model forced these questions not by arguing, but by existing. Attempt to replicate its success exposed how deep the blind spot ran. Some competitors reduced feature counts without addressing underlying complexity. Others extended warranties while leaving service difficulty unchanged. A few adjusted marketing language to emphasize reliability, but the lived experience told a different story. The results never matched, because the model's strength wasn't minimalism, it was intention. Every design choice acknowledged the reality of ownership, irregular maintenance, harsh environments, unpredictable use. The car didn't expect ideal behavior. It survived real behavior. That distinction separated philosophy from imitation. Inside the original company, tension rose. Sales teams pushed for upgrades to maintain excitement. Engineers resisted, citing long-term data. Each new feature risked breaking the balance that made the car dependable. The model had become a paradox. Successful because it refused to evolve aggressively. Leadership faced a decision: protect the model's integrity and accept slower growth, or chase trends and risk losing the very quality that made it exceptional. The compromise came in subtle form. Changes were introduced cautiously. Interfaces improved without adding layers. Materials evolved without increasing repair difficulty. The car changed, but only where aging data demanded it. Outside the company, competitors watched closely. The blind spot was no longer invisible. Analysts began tracking ownership duration. Media outlets discussed total cost of ownership with new seriousness. Buyers asked different questions in showrooms, not about what was new, but about what would last. The model had shifted the conversation, not through marketing, through patience. And that shift carried an uncomfortable implication. Progress measured by excitement had been misleading. Real progress revealed itself slowly, through consistency rather than spectacle. The industry could no longer claim ignorance. The blind spot had been exposed. Now came the harder part, deciding whether to look away or finally design for what happens after the first few years end. The industry's response unfolded gradually, almost reluctantly. No public admission followed. No executive announced a change in philosophy. But beneath the surface, priorities began to shift. Design briefs expanded their timelines. Engineers were asked not only how systems would perform at launch, but how they would behave after years of use. Service access mattered more. Software update strategies slowed. Feature roadmaps were filtered through a new question: would this still feel invisible 5 years from now? The model remained in production longer than expected, not because it dominated headlines, but because it refused to age poorly. Customers returned quietly. Fleets reordered. Used examples held their value with unusual stability. The car earned something rare in a fast-moving industry: trust over time. Eventually, its influence became visible in competitors' products. Interfaces simplified. Maintenance schedules grew more realistic. Longevity became a selling point instead of an afterthought. The language of ownership changed, even if no one credited the source. The model that exposed an industry blind spot never demanded recognition. It simply demonstrated that success measured at delivery is incomplete. That cars are not events, but companions, and that engineering brilliance means little if it doesn't survive ordinary life. In retrospect, the blind spot seems obvious, but that is always how blind spots appear, only after someone refuses to design around them. The model didn't revolutionize technology. It recalibrated attention, and by doing so, it reminded the industry of a simple truth it had overlooked for too long. What matters most is not what a car can do once. It's what it does quietly, reliably, year after year. Sometimes the smallest shift in perspective becomes the beginning of a new future. The